Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. Today I'll be talking about propositions 80 through 86. And I've been using the E.R. Dodds translation throughout the series. For those of you who don't have the text, there is a link in the description box that will lead you to a PDF version of the text. So I'll start today with Proposition 80. This one reads, "The proper nature of all bodies is to be acted upon, and of all incorporeals to be agents. The former, the bodies, are in themselves inactive, and the latter, the incorporeals, are impassible or incapable of suffering or feeling pain. But," he goes on, "through association with the body, the incorporeal too is acted upon, even as through partnership with incorporeals, bodies too can act." So here we are seeing soul as that midpoint between what is temporal and changes through time on the one hand, and on the other hand, that which is eternal. It is the midpoint between that which is mobile and changeable and that which is steadfast and unchanging. And we saw those two extremes in last week's video. You may want to go back over propositions 40 through 51 because that deals with the self-constituted. Just as a quick reminder of the self-constituted, because this is relevant for today's video, the self-constituted is that which gets its subsistence from itself. Proposition 41 read, "All that has its existence in another is produced entirely from another, but all that exists in itself is self-constituted." Proposition 42 told us that all that is self-constituted is capable of reversion upon itself. 43 closed up the logic there, saying all that is capable of reversion upon itself is self-constituted, turning around 42. Thus, whatever is able to revert upon itself is self-constituted. 44 tied the activity of reversion to the idea of existence, that it can be self-constituted both in activity and in existence. And existence is prior to activity. It has to exist before it can do something. 45 and 46 solidified the idea of being eternal, saying it's without temporal origin and also without an end. It's imperishable. 47, it is simple and without parts. 48 and 49, again solidifying the idea of being eternal or perpetual. Proposition 50 actually introduced the idea of becoming, or that which is in time, as a contrast to the self-constituted. And that was only introduced to round out this whole section on self-constitution with Proposition 51. And 51 states that all that is self-constituted transcends the things which are measured by time in respect of their existence. Now, this whole little review is helpful because the soul is self-constituted, and that means that it reverts on itself. It is simple and without parts. It has an eternal essence. And remember, Proposition 51 stated that the self-constituted transcends the temporal world. So now we're seeing that while soul has an essence that is eternal and unchanging and transcendent, there is at least an aspect of it which has an activity that is in time. It is affected by this physical substrate and it's changeable. If you go back to my previous video, the one just before this one, you'll see how the individual soul fits the descriptions there of the mobile and the potential. And so Proclus has to explain this middle role that soul occupies. He has to explain soul mingling with the body, yet also being separable and transcendent, able to revert on itself. And we want to keep this difficulty in mind as we go on through the various propositions that we'll be looking at today. So with that long setup, let's go back to Proposition 80. Again, it reads, the proper nature of all bodies is to be acted upon, and of all incorporeals, think soul here, to be agents, the former being in themselves inactive and the latter impassible. But through association with the body, the incorporeal too is acted upon, even as through partnership with incorporeals, bodies too can act. For body, qua body, has no character save divisibility, which renders it capable of being acted upon, being in every part subject to division, and that to infinity in every part. But the incorporeal is simple, and so it's impassible. For that which is without parts, cannot be divided, and that which is not composite is not subject to change. Either, then, there is no active principle, or the incorporeal is such, since body qua body is not an agent, but is subject only to being divided and acted upon. Again, every agent has an active potency, but body in itself is without quality and without potency. Therefore, it cannot act in virtue of being body, but only in virtue of a potency of action residing in it. That is, it acts, when it does act, by participation of potency. That's body. Further, even incorporeals participate passive affections when they come to be in a body, because they are then divided along with their bodies and feel the effect of the divisible nature of the latter, although in their own being they are without parts. Okay, so what he's saying here is that body, when it does act, it's by participation of potency. So our bodies, it looks like our bodies are moving, and yet we're only participating in soul. And that's why the body can move. It's only through participation in soul that the body can move. And he's also acknowledging in the last sentence here that the soul to some degree does connect to the body and therefore participates passive affections, as he's calling them here. I want to show you this chart again that I used with Proposition 64, and I think I used it in that last video as well. And here we see this contrast between substances complete in themselves, the self-constituted, versus what Proclus called irradiations, which are incomplete substances. They require a substrate. They're therefore in another, and they're changeable. And we saw this with the idea of being steadfast versus being mobile. What Proclus is acknowledging here is that there are aspects of soul, you might say, or energies of soul that fit both categories, and he has to explain that. And so that's really what today's propositions are focusing on. With that in mind, I'm going to go on to Proposition 81. This one reads, all that is participated without loss of separateness. Without loss of separateness means it doesn't lose its transcendency. And all that is participated without losing its transcendency is present to the participant through an inseparable or immanent potency which it implants. This one is a little bit tricky to read. Let me just read through it once, and then I will elucidate some of the points here. For if it is itself something separate from the participant and not contained in it, something which subsists in itself, then they need a mean term to connect them. In other words, if soul is transcendent, it's too different from body, and therefore there needs to be a mean term to connect them. One which more nearly resembles the participated principle than the participant does, and yet actually resides in the latter, in the higher principle. For if the former is separate or transcendent, then how can it be participated by that which contains neither it nor any emanation from it? Accordingly, a potency or irradiation, there's that word again, a potency or irradiation proceeding from the participated to the participant must link the two. And this medium of participation will be distinct from both. I want to remind you now of Proposition 23 that introduced the term unparticipated and said that it must create a participated term in order to connect itself to the participant. And the part in yellow, it will give something of itself, whereof the receiver becomes a participant, while the given, that which is given, attains a substantial existence of its own as a participated term. And at the time that I introduced this proposition, I used a diagram something like this, only instead of transcendent, I called it unparticipated. Instead of immanent, I called it participated. So those were the two principles, the transcendent, and it's really the transcendent and the immanent, but the language he used in Proposition 23 was unparticipated and participated. Now, just to confuse us a little bit more, he's using the word participated for the transcendent, saying participated without loss of separateness. And so it's hard to connect that to the unparticipated. It's not immediately obvious. But if you look at the language of Proposition 23 and you look, or at the way he talks about the terms unparticipated and participated in 23, and the way he talks about the participated without loss of separateness and that which it creates to connect itself to the participant, you'll see it very much fits together. In fact, keeping this up here, I'm going to read 81 while you're looking at this diagram, and you'll see that it fits very well. He says, if it is something separate from the participant, or transcendent, and not contained in it, something which subsists in itself, then they need a mean term to connect them, one which more nearly resembles the participated or transcendent principle than the participant does, and yet actually resides in the latter, in the higher. For if the former is separate, how can it be participated by that which contains neither it nor any emanation from it? Accordingly, a potency or irradiation proceeding from the, I'll say, transcendent to the participant must link the two. And this medium of participation will be distinct from both. And this idea of a potency or irradiation proceeding from it is very much like this idea of giving something of itself that attains a substantial existence as a participated term. So you might think of Proposition 81 as giving an example of Proposition 23, applying it to the soul. So now that he has clarified that soul is transcendent, but it has energies that are immanent, he now gives us Proposition 82. Every incorporeal, if it be capable of reverting upon itself, when it is participated by other things, is participated without loss of separateness. Or in other words, it is participated yet remains transcendent. For if it be participated inseparably, then its activity or its energy will no more be separable from the participant than will its existence. So in other words, both its essence and its activity would be changeable. And if this were so, it would not revert upon itself. For if it do so, if it does revert upon itself, it will be separate from the participant as one distinct thing over against another. If then it be capable of reverting upon itself, when participated by others, it is separably participated. Proposition 16, by the way, just reads that all that is capable of reverting upon itself has an existence that is separable from body. And so here he just really wants to clarify here that souls have a self-constituted essence and activity. And the activity of soul, we see in Proposition 83, is self-knowledge. All that is capable of self-knowledge is capable of every form of self-reversion. For that it is self-revertive in its activity is evident, since it knows itself. Knower and known are here one, and its cognition has itself as object. As the act of a knower, this cognition is an activity. And it is self-reversive, since in it the subject knows itself. But if in activity, then also in existence, as has been shown. For everything whose activity reverts upon itself has also an existence which is self-concentrated and self-contained. Proposition 44, just again, is the one that reminds us that existence comes before activity. So if it's self-revertive in its activity, it can't have an existence that is perishable. Okay, so just setting up there in Proposition 83 that the soul can know itself and therefore it is self-constituted and eternal. Propositions 84 and 85 fit nicely together. 84 reads, all that perpetually is infinite in potency. For if its subsistence is unfailing, then the potency, in virtue of which it is what it is and is able to exist, is likewise infinite, since this potency of being, if it were finite, would one day fail, which failing, the existence of its possessor would also fail, and that possessor would no longer be perpetual. Accordingly, that potency and perpetual being which maintains it in existence must be infinite. And I think this one is pretty self-explanatory. For anything to exist, it must have the power to exist. Therefore, if the existence is perpetual, then so must be the power of that existence. And Proposition 85 is a complement to Proposition 84. This one reads, all that perpetually comes to be has an infinite potency of coming to be. So whereas 84 addressed that which eternally has being, Proposition 85 addresses that which perpetually has becoming. Now, as I'm sure you remember, being is the term used for that which is eternal and outside of time. Becoming, or coming to be, is a term used to describe that which is temporal or in time. Before we go on, I just want to remind you of Proposition 55, which showed that of things that exist in time, some have a perpetual duration while others have a dated existence in a part of time. And without going through the whole thing, I do want to jump to the corollary. And the corollary reminds us that there are two kinds of perpetuity. One is eternal and the other in time. The eternal is a perpetual steadfastness, whereas the perpetual in time is a perpetual process. The eternal has an existence concentrated in a simultaneous whole. But to be perpetual throughout all of time is to be diffused and unfolded in temporal extension. Whereas the eternal is entire in itself, the perpetual in time is composed of parts, each of which exists separately in an order of succession. And back when I introduced Proposition 55, I showed a diagram something like this, where we have the hierarchy or the ranking of these three. There's the eternal, that which is outside of time, and then the temporal in a part of time is at the bottom, and in the middle is that which is perpetually becoming or perpetually coming to be. And this is what Proposition 85 is focusing on. All that perpetually comes to be has an infinite potency of coming to be. For if it perpetually comes to be, then the potency of becoming is unfailing in it. Since if this were finite, it would cease in the course of infinite time. And when the potency of becoming ceases, then the subject which comes to be in virtue of it must also cease and be no longer a subject of perpetual process. But by hypothesis, it is such a subject. Therefore, its potency of coming to be is infinite. So in other words, in that chart I showed you, this was that middle term. If it had a finite potency, then it would be in that lower rank. Okay, let's round out today's discussion with Proposition 86. Now, on the surface, it seems out of place in today's discussion, but after I read through this, I will explain why it belongs in this section. All true being is infinite, neither in number nor in size, but only in potency. For all infinitude is either of quantity or of bulk, or else of potency. Now true being is infinite as having an unquenchable life, an unfailing subsistence, and an undiminished activity. But it is not infinite in virtue of its size. For true being is self-constituted, is devoid of magnitude, since all that is self-constituted is without parts and simple. Nor is it so in virtue of its number, for if it has the utmost unity, is standing closest to the one, and is most nearly akin to the latter. Its infinitude is in respect of potency. And we saw back in Propositions 61 and 62 that unity is commensurate with power, and that is a key idea in Platonic metaphysics. And it will come up again and again. So you can probably just already look ahead and see that both Propositions 61 and 62 are cited here. Okay. Its infinitude is in respect of potency. Accordingly, what renders it indivisible makes it also infinite. And a being is more infinite in proportion as it is more one and indivisible. The idea of relative infinity is a difficult concept, and it comes up more directly in Propositions 93 and 95. So I'm going to hold off on that discussion, but for now it's enough to see that what is more one and indivisible is more powerful or has greater potency. For as a potency is divided, it becomes weak and finite. And potencies completely divided are in every way finite. The last potencies, which are most remote from the one, are in every way finite because of their partition, while the first are infinite because they are without parts. For partition dissipates and dissolves the potency of the individual, so the more differentiated, the less powerful. But indivisibility, compressing and concentrating that potency, it keeps itself contained without exhaustion or diminution, so that which is more unified is more potent. But infinitude of size or number signifies a complete lapse from indivisibility and total privation of it. For the quantitative finite is nearest to the indivisible, and the quantitative infinite, which has completely escaped from unity, is the most remote. Hence, infinitude of potency cannot reside in anything infinite in number or size, since infinite potency accompanies indivisibility, and the infinite of number or size stands furthest from the indivisible. If, then, being were infinite in size or number, it would not have infinite potency. But it does have infinite potency. Therefore, it is not infinite in number or size. Now you can see that the next section is titled Of Being, Limit, and Infinitude. And so we got something of a preview of being here. And at first it does seem out of place in today's discussion, and I did consider holding it off until my next video. However, this line right here does tie nicely into today's discussion, and it makes it absolutely relevant. So we can think of each soul as being simple and without parts, but also we tend to think of souls in the plural. I have a soul, you have a soul, and so on. However, we just concluded that the soul is self-constituted and it's infinite in potency. Therefore, a further way to understand this is that what Proclus is saying here about being can also be applied to the soul. Ultimately, it is one and is closer to being in the metaphysical hierarchy than it would be if there were an infinite number of souls. So what we're seeing here is that even though Proclus is known for being logical and methodical in his approach to metaphysics, he's also very much a mystic. And while we can talk about having individual souls, ultimately, he's saying soul is one. So as always, I do hope you found that helpful. Please give it a like and leave me a comment, and I hope that you'll join me next time.